right, so sorry about that. Not usually that we'll have 5 different technical difficulties all at once. So we are wrapping up our study in Isaiah tonight. That's the plan anyway. We will then still need to fill a couple of weeks before we're going to start the Gospel of John in January for the first quarter. So Justin and I were just talking about some things we can do to fill the next couple of weeks. One thing we might do is do just kind of an extension on some of the historical background of Isaiah that we've been talking about. Talk about some of those battles and the fun stuff from Isaiah that we can kind of get more actual historical and archaeological evidence and things that show the veracity of the Bible story and those kind of things. So we may do that next week, and then whatever Justin feels like doing that next week. So we'll kind of play that. We'll play that by ear a little bit. So you don't have an assignment tonight at the end of the lesson, which is good because we're not real sure what the assignment is yet. So tonight, Isaiah 38, 39, keeping faith in difficult circumstances, and hopefully we'll provide the basis, especially later on as we get down to the continuities, for some meaningful discussion. Tonight, our objective is to reflect on how illness and pride challenge the faith of Hezekiah and all who follow him. Because the things that happen at the end of Hezekiah's life really affect the nation of Israel in some very significant ways over the next several generations and even into the final captivity of Israel or Judah in Babylon. So kind of putting that in a historical perspective is an interesting conversation. We want to reflect on what it means to rely on or trust in God, because when everything around you is on the verge of being taken away and you have nowhere else to turn, that really puts it into perspective how important it is to trust in God. And then reflect on the ways in which our impending death alters our ongoing life. So not just to look at it from an outsider's perspective of, here's how Hezekiah dealt with the news that he had about his impending death, but how does that give us pause or give us the opportunity to kind of reflect on our own lives and how we would face that situation or that scenario if we were in it. So our theme for tonight, faith in God, is challenged by illness and pride, and we see that that tension between who we know Hezekiah to be, who is a good king, a faithful king, and yet some difficulties that he faces later in life and how he deals with those things and even some sinful attitudes and things as well. So how do we reconcile the fact that Hezekiah is a good king, he's a faithful king, he's someone that we should emulate and someone that we should study from the standpoint of following in his footsteps, and yet he wasn't perfect. And so there's some good discussion there as well. So once again, as always, I like the review that is built into this study, because if you can't just kind of sit back and pause and think about the first 39 chapters of Isaiah and kind of put those into some context at this point, wow, maybe you weren't paying attention is what I would tell my students at school, but because we've done this every week, and we should be able to kind of now sit back and have a general idea of the outline and flow of the first 39 chapters of Isaiah. And that's helpful as we put Isaiah into its historical context, as we think about all the things that are going on around it. So chapters 1 through 12 are during that period of Syro-Ephraimite war, when the northern kingdom, the Ephraimites, that is northern Israel, teamed up with the Syrian Empire, and they brought war against Judah, and how King Ahaz, how he dealt with that. And he was supposed to trust in God, but he chose not to, and he called on the Assyrians for help. And then that set into motion some difficulties that came about later on. 13 through 23 is there's that bridge between the first 12 and the last section of chapters that represent a wide range of historical settings. There's the woes pronounced against a variety of nations and things like that. So it's a very prophetic section that brings up the judgment that God is bringing against all these godless nations. And then these last 15 or 16 chapters or so that we've looked at in 24 through 39 take place during the Assyrian siege and the aftermath of that. And so we've got a narrative section here, chapters 36 through 39, and we'll talk more about that idea of narrative here in just a minute. Isaiah 36 and 37 narrates scenes from the Assyrian invasion in 701 BC, and just a quick overview there. King Sennacherib invaded Judah in 701. He attacked and subdued 46 cities, according to his own count and historical records that bear those out. And then the Assyrian army advanced. As the Assyrian army advanced, Sennacherib sent emissaries calling for surrender, and he sent that guy Rabshakeh with it that he sent last week to call for the surrender of Jerusalem. And then, but at the same time, Isaiah is calling for trust in God. And Hezekiah ultimately demonstrates trust in God. He prays to God, and God delivers the nation from the Assyrian siege. So, significant things historically taking place during that section. And the final 4 chapters there, 36 through 39, take up 3 crucial events unfolding like a 3-act play. So last week we saw that first act, the siege of Jerusalem. Tonight we'll take a look at the second, Acts 2 and 3. Act 2 is Hezekiah's illness in chapter 38, and then Act 3 is the Babylonian visit to Jerusalem in chapter 39. And chapter 39 especially is a very short chapter. 38 is not very long, but 39 especially is a short chapter, so we should be able to get those all covered, hopefully, tonight. And one more thing about the historical setting, based on the dates of Merodach Baladan, which is some of the things that are taking place here. It said Hezekiah's illness is often set in 704 BC, and that puts it right in line with what we know about the Assyrian siege that was taking place. And I think here Sennacherib said it, but I think Sennacherib actually is, I think I put that wrong there. The Assyrian invasion, Sennacherib's reign was from 701 to 704 is what I recall from some previous notes. And so I think the invasion itself is in 704, which is in line with Hezekiah's illness, which we'll see takes place concurrently with the siege. It's taking place at the same time that that army seems to be surrounding the city. So, so there you go. Am I leaving anything out? I feel like I'm going here. I need to remember you're sitting next to me.
That's okay. I'll
Okay.
keep on keeping on.
All right, so here we go. All right. Isaiah 38, 39 is a narrative section, and really 36 through 39 is a narrative section. And he gave some interesting, kind of an interesting format for unpacking narrative sections of the Bible. The Bible, there are different literary styles or literature styles within the scriptures, just like when you were sitting in your English literature class and you had to study a section on poetry and a section on other stuff. Wasn't my favorite subject. I'd rather been in math class. But so in the Bible, there are different sections. There's poetry, there's prophecy, there's narrative, there's there are genealogies. And so how we read different sections of the Bible depends on what type of literature it is. And so when we're in a narrative section like that, we need to read and be able to retell that story. We need to be familiar with the story, and as you read through it and then you sit back and think about it, you need to tell that story back to yourself and sort of ruminate on that story, and then go back and read it again and see if, did I have the story right? Did I retell that story correctly in the right order with the right details, with the right emphases and those kind of things? So there's a reading and a retelling of the story as we study these narratives. And then as we take note of some things. We take note of special theological, specific theological language or themes that are used through a section. The Bible authors often will use repetition of certain words or phrases to sort of draw our attention to the main themes and main points that they want us to understand from the telling of that story. Remember that Bible stories are told for a reason. They're not unbiased in their report. This is not you think of the old time reporters who used to tell news stories without bias, and they would just deliver the facts, and that's all they would give you. And it wasn't, trying to sway your opinion in one way or another. It was just for the telling of facts. But that's not what the Bible does. The Bible makes no excuses for the fact that it tells its stories in such a way so that it tries to sway us. It wants us to understand things from God's perspective, and it wants us to make a choice that is in line with God's will. And so as we read through these things and as we unpack that narrative story, we need to say, what is it that the writer, the Holy Spirit of God wants us to derive from this, wants us to understand from this? And then that fits right in with this last point, that we don't force meaning into the story. I don't sit back and say, I kind of have this idea about something that I want the Bible to say, and so I'm going to go find a story in the Bible, and then I'm going to fit my preconceived notion into that story and say, look, this story can fit what I already believe. That's never what we should do. And so we do that sometimes with doctrinal things or with cultural things, that we want our own opinion to be validated by the Bible, when what we should do is read the Bible and allow it to tell its story, and then we form our opinions and our beliefs around what the Bible says. So we don't force meaning into the story, we extract meaning from the story. So that's sort of the approach that he uses through this section as he kind of unpacks some of the narrative things that are going on in chapters 38, 39. In the notes, I think it's a little more clear. I probably didn't follow it as clearly on the slides as he makes it in the notes, where he kind of follows this sort of four-step process as he's moving along. So, but I thought that was helpful, and I thought it was interesting for us to think about for a moment before we jump in. So let's look at Isaiah 38, verses 1 through 8. You ready to read?
I'm ready.
I don't think there's a bunch of weird names in this one like we stuck me with last week. So, all right. Isaiah 38, 1 through 8.
All right. In those days, Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death. Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, came to him and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die. You shall not recover." Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord and said, "Please, O Lord, remember how I've walked before you in faithfulness and with a whole heart, and I've done what is good in your sight." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. Then the word of the Lord came to Isaiah, "Go and say to Hezekiah, thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Behold, I will add 15 years to your life. I will deliver you and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and will defend this city. This shall be the sign to you from the Lord, that the Lord will do this thing that he has promised. Behold, I will make the shadow cast by the declining sun on the dial of Ahaz turn back 10 steps. So the sun turned back on the dial, and the 10 steps by which it had declined."
Okay, so this is an interesting thing to have happen, an interesting turn of events, because what did we just spend the last two chapters seeing that God was going to do? I mean, the Assyrians are camped outside the gate, and what happens?
They die.
They die.
They die.
I mean,
They
they're
don't wake
there.
up.
They're there with cruel intentions, with malicious intent, and they intend to kill Hezekiah and his followers. But what ends up happening? Hezekiah survives. He lives, only to find out within the context of that. When does this take place? It says in those days. Well, in what days? Well, in the days that the Assyrian army was camped outside the gate, Hezekiah comes down with a terminal illness. And Isaiah comes to him and says, "You're not going to survive this. It's not the Assyrians that are going to kill you. God's going to protect. God's going to do what God said he would do. He will protect the city. He will defend the nation, but you're toast. You're not going to make it." And so how does, and we don't want to, well, we'll get into later, provided we have time, we'll get into, kind of some of the ways that Hezekiah reacts and others react to this news. But Hezekiah and Isaiah have this dialogue about his health. So what claim does Hezekiah make in his prayer?
I have walked in faithfulness, and I've done what's good.
Okay. I have followed you in truth and with a whole heart and have done what is good in thy sight. True? Yeah. I mean, have we talked about some mistakes that Hezekiah made? What's a big mistake that Hezekiah made?
We went to get help.
Yeah,
Because the
he
Egyptians-
sent to Egypt for help. The Assyrian army was coming. He sent envoys to Egypt. He was testing the waters there, seeing if there was an alliance to be had. There wasn't. And so he had nowhere else to turn, so he turned to God. Teresa,
In our weaknesses, can't we make the same claim?
in our weaknesses,
With our weaknesses, I guess.
yeah. And so I'm not trying, I don't want to be too hard on Hezekiah because I think Hezekiah is a good king. Hezekiah, you know, if we have to pick, if we have to rank the order of the best kings of Israel or Judah, Hezekiah is up there, if not at the top, very near the top. He did good things that no other kings had done. He removed all of the high places that even David had left in place. And so, so there were good things that Hezekiah did that other good kings before him had not done. And just because you're a good king doesn't mean that you're perfect and you never have faults or flaws. So we don't want to be too hard on him. And so I think it's okay for him to say these things. And it, you know, it's an interesting approach. What does James 4 tell us about the way that we need to approach God? Are we supposed to go to God and start enumerating our successes and achievements before Him?
In humility.
Yeah, we're supposed to humble ourselves and allow Him to exalt us. So it's an interesting prayer from the standpoint that Hezekiah kind of goes to God and says, you know, God, I've been a good guy. I've done the right thing. I've followed you as best I could.
Did he see death maybe as a punishment?
Well, he's not happy about it. I mean, his response after the prayer is to weep bitterly, and I don't know that that's a wrong response. That's another part of what I want to talk about if we get to it later. Did Hezekiah do this? Was Hezekiah wrong in the way he reacted? I mean, how do we react when we face our mortality? Is there a verse that tells us how we have to act, that God will not accept us if we don't act the right way when faced with our mortality? I don't think we can go there. So I don't know that Hezekiah does anything wrong here, but it's interesting the way that he responds. And we'll, you know, it's one of those things where what do we take away from it? Well, here's a man of God who was faithful, who was a good man, who was a good king, who faced horrible, horrible things in his life. And when faced with his own death, it scared him. I mean, he was fearful. He was sad.
Can we figure out how old he was, though, from when he became king?
Usually somewhere it would be 2 Kings 20 should give us the end. Maybe tell us how long he reigned. 2 Kings 18, I think, has the beginning of his reign, and 20 has the end. So sometimes, usually right at the beginning or the end, it'll tell us how long they reigned and how old they were when they got in.
He was 25 when he got in.
Okay, and he reigned, I don't know how long, I can't remember. I'm certain that there are, you know, timelines that would give us that information if I had thought to look it up. Second Chronicles 30, 31, 32, somewhere in that range too would be.
2 Kings 18 says he was 25 years old when he began, and he reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem.
Okay, so 29 years. So he had 14 years, and then found out he was sick, and then his life got extended 15 years. So,
Google says 54.
29 plus. Thank you. I was just doing it. It's hard to do math in front of people. 29 plus 25 would be 54. Boy, that doesn't sound very old.
Well, I mean, this is even 15 years on the other side.
So
of it,
when he was 25 plus 39, 25 plus 14 would be 39.
Yeah.
So when he's 39, he finds out he's about to die.
No wonder he got cheated.
Well, no, well, yeah, I mean, that's a life cut short. 54 is a life cut short, I want you to know. So, you know, it's an interesting thought, and I want to get through the lesson, but I also want to come back and visit some of those things again if we have time at the end, and if we don't have time at the end, we'll come back and do it another time. What theologically significant words are repeated? And I had a notebook somewhere when I left my house that I don't see with me that I had some passages written down on. We'll see if I can remember some of them. And remember, it's chapters 36 through 39 that are a narrative unit. And so if we go back to chapters 36 and 37, and we see some of the words that are kind of repeated during that siege, especially when Rabshakeh is doing his thing, we can find some significant parallels. Okay, so if you go back to chapter 36, we'll pick one of them out because I can do this from memory. Go back to 36:13, and I'm going to start reading. I'm going to read a couple of verses. You tell me which word gets repeated. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in Judean and said, "Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely deliver us. The city shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me, and come out to me, and each of you his vine, and each of his fig tree, and drink each of the waters of his own cistern. Until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of grain, and new wine, a land of bread, and vineyards. Beware lest Hezekiah mislead you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any one of the gods of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the kings of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, and have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among the gods of these lands have delivered their land from my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand?" So what word got repeated? Deliver. Okay? And so there's a theological significance to that idea. Rabshakeh is not doing that, you know, haphazardly. Rabshakeh is playing games with the people, and this is what's that word when they propaganda. It's a military tactic, and he is using that word deliver over and over and over again on purpose. So what is a word that we see back in chapter 38, verse 6? What does God tell Hezekiah in verse 6?
I will deliver you.
I will deliver you. Okay? And so, and he says here, and this is something, by the way, that puts it in within the time frame. We know this is during that siege period, because what does he say? I will deliver you from the city and from the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city. So the siege is still going on. God is reiterating a promise that he makes at the end of chapter 37 verse 35. I will defend this city to save it for my own sake, for my servant David's sake.
He reigned 29 years.
And so there's that repetition of the word deliver, and we also see the word defend there used in two different seeds. So this, Johnny.
One of the things, I don't want to disrupt you here, but one of the things that keeps popping in my head here is, again, one of the things that we said that he was such a good king about was that he took down all those idols.
Uh-huh.
And here they are saying, oh, well, all of those idols, all of those other gods didn't defend their people,
Yeah.
but, they should be helping you. And he actually tells them, he said, look how bad he was. He took down your idols, and now you don't have any of these gods to defend you. But then he brags about the fact that he defeated all those gods.
Yeah. Well, Rabshakeh plays both. If say he plays both sides of the fence, but really he's playing like all sides of the wall. I mean, because he's on one hand he tells them your God can't save you, and then on the other hand he says your God came and told me to come get you. And so, well, which is it? If your God is powerful enough to save you, then why is he, or not powerful enough to save you, then why is he powerful enough to tell me to come get you? So Yeah, he's not saying anything truthfully or honestly. He's just saying whatever he can say to try to drive a wedge in their faith. But that word that keeps getting repeated there, that idea of deliverance, well, deliverance is a theologically significant theme in this section. We need to pay attention to the idea of deliverance. And so if we're going to think about God as a deliverer, this is a section of Scripture that we want to look at. He delivers the city of Jerusalem. He delivers Hezekiah himself. Well, what does that tell us about God? He is our deliverer as well. And so we have a significant theme there that we need to take note of. Let's also look at Hezekiah's prayer and Isaiah's response in 9 through 20. So go ahead and read that section there.
9 through 20. A writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, after he had been sick and had recovered from his sickness. I said, in the middle of my days I must depart. I am consigned to the gates of Sheol for the rest of my years. I said, I shall not see the Lord in the land of the living. I shall look on man no more among the inhabitants of the world. My dwelling is plucked up and removed from me, like a shepherd's tent. Like a weaver I have rolled up my life. He cuts me off from the loom. From day to night you bring me to an end. I calmed myself until morning. Like a lion he breaks all my bones. From day to night you bring me to an end. Like a swallow or a crane I chirp. I moan like a dove. Your eyes are weary with looking upward. O Lord, I am oppressed. Be my pledge of safety. What shall I say? For he has spoken to me, and he himself has done it. I walk slowly all my years because of the bitterness of my soul. O Lord, by these things men live, and in all these is the life of my spirit. Restore me to health and make me live. Behold, it was for my welfare that I had great bitterness, but in love you delivered my life from the pit of destruction. For you have called all my sins behind your back, and cast all your sins behind my back. For Sheol does not thank you, death does not praise you. Those who go down to the pit do not hope for faithfulness. The living, he thanks you. As I do this day, the Father makes known to the children your faithfulness. The Lord will save me, and we will play my music on stringed instruments all the days of our lives at the house of the Lord.
Okay, so Hezekiah's prayer and then Isaiah's response. Well, Hezekiah's prayer can be divided into 5 parts. So this, I think, is in the notes there. But the first 4.5 verses or so lament over his impending death. And we've talked about lament before. It's been a while since we've addressed the idea of lament. But lament is a language of faith. And sometimes we look at lament as being like, wow, buck up, young camper, or pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you really shouldn't be feeling that way. If you're faithful, then lament really is, we have this idea that lament, reveals a weak faith. But lament really reveals a strong faith. Jesus lamented. He wept over the city of Jerusalem. He wept at the grave of Lazarus. Jesus practiced lament. And so here Hezekiah, as a man of faith, is expressing lament at the thought of his own mortality, at the thought of that he had to face the end of his life. And this is something that he wrote after he's been promised, an extension to his life. So this is him reflecting back on how he felt at receiving the news that he was going to die. And go back to that moment when he received that news, and he wept bitterly. He was in the depths of despair, and it's okay. It doesn't mean that his faith was lost. It doesn't mean that he didn't love God anymore. It doesn't mean that he wasn't faithful or wasn't trusting in God. It just means that he was having an emotional response to the news that his life was nearly over. At the end of verse 14, we have, oh Lord, I am oppressed, be my security. And it's a petition to God. He recognizes, and this is a key portion of lament, is the recognition or the acknowledgement that God is the source of help, that there is no internal source of help. I can't help myself. I have to rely on God to help me through this time, whatever it is. And so this is Hezekiah coming to this conclusion, or coming to the end of this cycle of lament, saying, I have nowhere else to turn. Has Hezekiah ever been in a position before where he had nowhere else to turn? Had those times come out okay? Yeah. I mean, he'd been here before, not in regards to his own health, but in other scenarios. And so it's not surprising that he turns to God in this scenario because he had turned to God before. And that's the only place he had left to turn. Verse 15, there's confession. If he's a man of faith, what's the need for confession?
Because of our weaknesses.
Because of our weaknesses. He knows he's not perfect. He knows he's made mistakes. He knows that, anytime we especially face our own mortality, I think one of the things that we have to face in that moment is the idea that there were things I could have done differently, things that I could have done better in this life, and those things kind of hit you pretty hard when you're facing your own demise. And so he confesses those things. He doesn't want to take those things with him. He wants to leave those things behind, so he confesses them. Verses 16 and 17 have the moment of deliverance. By these things men live, he says in verse 16, and in all these is the life of my spirit. Restore me to health and let me live. For my own welfare, I had great bitterness. Bitterness is something, again, that we don't like to talk about. That Hezekiah was bitter over the loss of his own health. He was bitter over the loss of his own life. And it's an emotion. God gave us our emotions, and we've got to deal with those sometimes in some very difficult contexts. But it was him. It was God who had kept his soul from the pit, and it was God who had cast all his sins behind him. So God was the one that delivered Hezekiah from that death. And then lament often, not always, but often ends with a section of praise or thanksgiving. And so here Hezekiah does have this section of thanksgiving where he acknowledges what God has done that nobody else could do for him. And it's not insignificant. It's a significant thing for him to pronounce this thanksgiving. It's significant for him to recognize that God is the one that gave him a new lease on life, as it were.
I think one of the things that I thought was interesting reading, the living, he thanks you as I do this day. And I was just, thinking the contrast here between the living and the dead. The dead people, obviously, those in Sheol are kind of contrasted here with the living. And the living are the ones who thanks him. And I was just kind of thinking, if the dead people aren't necessarily thanking him, and I am a part of the living, how often am I, thanking God? And it just kind of, I don't know if that song, if the rocks cry out, I'll cry out or whatever. But the idea of, well, if they're, I wouldn't say make up for, but I gotta give thanks a lot so that, maybe that's just me, that's just weird, but let's thank God more, I guess.
Well, I like it in the context of there are things that the living can do that the dead cannot do. And one of those things, he ends that by saying they will play my songs on stringed instruments all the days of our life at the house of the Lord. And so the dead, whatever their state is, they can't go to the house of the Lord and praise. And so Hezekiah is here is saying, I have a new life that I'm going to be able to spend in worship to God. That he acknowledges he would not be able to do those things had he died. And so, when faced with our own mortality and kind of, it's kind of almost a trope or a stereotype of something that somebody would do, in a moment of difficulty or a moment of uncertainty when things could kind of go either way. And what do people often do? They start making promises to God, right? God, if you see me through this, I'll never sin again. I'll be a perfect person. I'll undo all those bad things that I've done. They start making all those promises, and then they come through that moment, and I had my fingers crossed. God, did you see that? I wasn't really serious about all those things I said. But Hezekiah here has come through that. He's on the other side of it, and so he now he's not making a promise in the moment saying, if you see me through this, I'll praise you. He's saying, you have seen me through that, and because of that, I'm going to give grace to you and thanksgiving to you. So I think there's a difference there in what Hezekiah is doing, but what do you do with that extra time? If you are told today by God, I'm giving you 15 more years, what do you spend that 15 years doing? Does that affect the way does having a date stamp on it change the way that you live? Hezekiah seems to indicate that it does for him. He knows what he's going to do. He's going to spend it praising God. And so, does he do it perfectly? Nope. He's going to make some goofs here in a minute. I didn't include it, I don't know if I missed it in the notes or what, but verses 21 and 22, I didn't get into the reading. Read 21 and 22 because that's interesting.
Now Isaiah had said, let them take a cake of figs and apply it to the boil, that he may recover. Hezekiah also had said, what is the sign that I shall go up to the house of the Lord?
Okay, so Hezekiah, we know, had a terminal illness that was going to end his life. And Greg, help me with this one.
Well,
He had, that terminal illness was in the form of a boil that got healed by raisins.
well, I'm just guessing, but I suspect, there, even as much as 100 years ago, people died of furuncles, boils, that would become septic, and because we had no antibiotics.
Yeah.
But if you could get it to drain, then, so they would land some and that sort of thing. I don't know if they heated the figs to make a poultice to help it drain, or how that worked, but it would probably help if they had.
Well, there you go. He was going to die of a boil. I don't understand that, but it's
Well,
just an
you've heard of
infection.
cellulitis, where people get a bad infection, end up in the hospital, getting IV antibiotics.
Yeah.
Same kind of deal.
Okay, so he had an infection that was in the form of a boil.
It probably wasn't just a little one.
It was not a little one, I imagine.
Had
It
to
was
make a big
probably
cake.
probably big. And think about what they've been going through. They're in the midst of a siege. During a siege, their sanitary conditions were not what they normally would have been. Who knows if there's a relationship there between that? But there's all kinds of other things that are going on historically in the context of that moment. So I'm just glad they had some figs. So there you go. All right. So Hezekiah had said, "What is the sign that I shall go up to the house of the Lord?" Well, he had been given a sign earlier that in the stairway the sun would back up 10 steps, and so that's not an insignificant amount of time. Think about as the sun advances and the shadow creeps up those steps, and then the sun has to back up in order for that shadow to move backwards. It's not an insignificant thing. That's not like a blip. That's a significant amount of anti-rotation you had to do there as it was facing the sun. So there's already been a sign given daylight savings days around the clock. Okay. So let's look at chapter 39. Babylon's envoys visit Hezekiah. Another interesting scenario in Hezekiah's life.
Right. Isaiah 39:1. At the time, Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he had heard that he had been sick and had recovered. Hezekiah welcomed them gladly, and he showed them his treasure house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil, his whole armory, all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in his house or in all his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet came to Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say, and from where did they come to you?" Hezekiah said, "They have come to me from a far country, from Babylon." And he said, "What have they seen in your house?" Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them." And then Isaiah says to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house, and that which your fathers have stored up till this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, And some of your own sons, who will come from you, whom you shall father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good, for he thought, there will be peace and security in my days.
Okay. Interesting stuff going on. Okay, so Babylon's envoys visit Hezekiah. The story divides into two units. First, the visit from Babylon takes place in the first couple of verses, and then Hezekiah gets a visit from Isaiah, and that takes a whole different turn than the visit from Babylon. So, what is the sort of the tenor of the details of the story of the visit from Babylon? This guy Merodach Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon. So he's a prince of Babylon, and he comes to visit. Why does he come to visit Hezekiah?
Because he was sick, and he had heard he was sick and recovered.
Heard that he had been sick and recovered. King had him oiled, he got better.
Well, if they die, that's easy pickings. That's all I'm saying.
Maybe. It doesn't seem like enough to me that it was just the idea of the king was sick and we sent an envoy.
Maybe I assume he's aware that everyone woke up dead. And he must think, holy moly, this guy's got some connections with God.
Okay, so I think there's something else going on there. Who was, if you think of Babylon sort of being on the rise at this point, and who is the dominant world power at this point, has been Assyria for generations. And here you have Babylon, who kind of sees themselves as the up-and-comers, and you did what to Assyria? Their armies where? And you did it how? Okay, I imagine there was some discussion about, tell me about the army of Assyria and how you did that kind of thing. I would imagine there was some of that discussion.
But why would he show him everything that was in his palace?
We're going to talk about that in just a minute. That's on the next slide. What else? Okay, so what was the sign that God gave Hezekiah that he was going to survive this? Well, he healed the boil, but what was the sign?
The sun went back.
The sun went back a significant amount in one day. About the same time that the Assyrian army was destroyed, and about the same time the king of Israel, who was lying on his deathbed, all of a sudden was healed. There was a lot of things happening, all kind of significant things going on all at once. So it's not far-fetched that the king of Babylon would send an envoy to kind of figure out what's going on here. Who are these people and how did they do all this? And so when the king's envoy shows up to talk to Hezekiah and presumably ask him some things about how all this happens, what does Hezekiah do? Come look at all my neat stuff. What do we not have a record of Hezekiah?
Giving God the credit.
Giving God.
We don't have a record of Hezekiah saying, let me tell you about the God that I serve. Let me tell you about the God that healed me when I was sick and on my deathbed. Let me tell you about the God who destroyed the army of the Assyrian nation when they camped on our doorstep. Let me tell you about the God who turned the sun backwards so that he would give me a sign knowing that it was going to be okay. Let me show you my stuff. That's what Hezekiah did. And so Hezekiah's actions, there's some these are like some things he put in the notes that are like, okay, so why did Hezekiah do what Hezekiah did? Was he just naive? Was he just like, here's a foreign dignitary. I don't get those very often. We're kind of a small kingdom, and here's a big kingdom coming to visit and not bringing an army with him to try to take my stuff away. So it's kind of cool that I have some stuff to show him. He's just naive about it. Is that a possibility?
Maybe, I think it's careless.
Maybe. Was he practicing routine courtesy? where he just was like, yeah, this is what you do. This is what you do when a visiting envoy comes, you show them all your stuff.
You show them all of your political capital,
Yeah.
all of your military might,
Yeah.
everything. I'm going to show that my enemies, well,
Was he being prideful? Okay, was he turning from God to power and possessions? Was he getting a taste of power and getting to kind of hang out with the big dogs and say, you know, I really like this. We're a kingdom to be reckoned with now. Was he acting prideful in that way? Was he turning to God? Or was he being politically clever by positively showing his assets to a potential ally?
Well, how quickly did he forget being on his deathbed and the conversation that he had with God?
And so those were some interesting possibilities. I tend to go with number 3. I think he was being prideful. I think he was kind of showing his stuff and not maybe giving God the glory and the credit. And I think that follows based on what happens next. You know, what Isaiah says and things.
So if God tells you you're going to live 15 more years, what does that do to a king that has fought battles and stuff? Does he all of a sudden think I'm invincible for at least
Well,
15 years?
Maybe that's possibly part of it as well. You know, I know I've got 15 more years left, and so this guy's not going to end my life. So I don't have to fear this guy, and so I don't have to fear his army. That, you know, I hadn't considered that aspect of it, but that's possible as well. It could be motivating Hezekiah. Tim?
He's being human.
He's being human. If only we weren't. Sometimes, you know, if only we didn't have to deal with that. I think you're exactly right. He's making a bad choice. Part of the human condition. What about Isaiah's response? How does Isaiah respond? He comes and puts Hezekiah in his place. Hezekiah's response to Isaiah then, this news that, what you've done here has angered God. Hear the word of the Lord of hosts, verse 5. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that is in your father's have laid up in store to this day shall be carried to Babylon. All this stuff that you've shown him, one day it's going to Babylon as booty, as captured stuff, right? So, how do you feel about that, Hezekiah?
this was my favorite part of this whole, because I read it and I laughed out loud because Hezekiah's just saying, ain't my problem. Ain't nobody got time for that. I mean, they're going to have to deal with it. It ain't me. I got 15 years of good life left. Let's go.
So, so, I mean, that's essentially, and so Hezekiah, I mean, does Hezekiah's comment reflect a self-centered response? It's like, that's not my problem. I don't have to worry about it. Or is it a comment, is it a prayer asking for God to delay this future reality? Like, God, put it off till the end of my life. Please don't let me face this. I don't know. Hezekiah's comment echoes what he already knew about his own future. My future is kind of set. God has made already this promise to me that my 15 years are already kind of set. So this just fits what I already know about my own life to be true. And then the last one, Hezekiah's comment reflects an obedient king who accepts God's judgment in faith. That's the one I want it to be. I mean, but I don't know if that's the one it is. How did David respond when he learned about the fate of his the child that he and Bathsheba had, the first baby? As long as the baby lived, what did David do? He fasted and prayed. As soon as the baby died, the servants didn't want to tell him. Like, we can't tell him, it's killing him now, just knowing the baby's sick. When we tell him the baby's died, then it's going to destroy him. But what does David do? Don't point at the clock. Nobody cares.
He gets up and moves on with life.
He gets up and moves on with life because he accepts what God had told him. He accepted what God had said. As long as the baby lived, I prayed and fasted, hoping that it would change the outcome, but God's will was set. And so this is Hezekiah's response here, saying, God has made his decision. God has made up his mind, and I can't argue with it. I can't change it, and so I'll just accept it. Yeah.
There's a callousness in him because some of his sons are taken off and made eunuchs. Therefore, he's not going to get grandchildren from them.
Yeah.
And he doesn't even, there's no mention. He just has, he's no feeling about it. It's just.
it seems that way if we read it just as just on the, but then, go back to how we read narrative. Do we take the meaning out that was intended to be brought to us? Are we intended, is this, the purpose of this story to tell us Hezekiah's feelings about what happened? Or is the meaning of the story in the previous verses that tells us, Hezekiah made his mistake, and when we make mistakes in our relationship with God, there's going to be consequences? Johnny?
One of the things the commentary in my Bible said was, if we look at who takes over after him as king, it's Manasseh. He takes over when he's 12, which means he wasn't born at this point in time.
Would have been better.
Isaiah is actually telling him he's going to have kids, which he didn't have.
Would have been better for the nation if Hezekiah had died
Right.
instead of his life being extended, which is a hard thing to say because Hezekiah was a good man. He was a faithful king. And even after this, he did good things. But
Good
he
king.
also fathered Manasseh in those 12 years, in those 15 years, and Manasseh was the worst of all the kings. Although, it seems that at the end of his life, Manasseh turned it around. He did repent, but it was too little too late. So at least for Manasseh, maybe he set things right, but it was too late for the nation based on what he did. We didn't even get to the part I really wanted to get to, so we're going to come back to it at another time.
Well, in God's omniscience, he knew what was gonna happen, right? When he gave,
Well, sure. I mean, God knew what was going to happen.
God knew Manasseh would come.
But God knows we got to get all the way down to Jesus anyway. So we got to get some things set into motion. So it's going to be okay. Thank you.
Next week.
Next week, we're going to come back and at least visit part of this again because there's some things I want to talk about in relation to it. And then we'll talk about some historical things that are, we're going to talk about Lachish, the city that kind of figured prominently last week. And then, we'll look at some pictures.
We just had two short.
It's Justin, he just chatters on and on and on.